Welcome to TOAMagic.com's Auction of the People pre-stream. We're breaking down the 8 decks that will be featured in this exclusive event for the top 8 players in our EE6 leaderboard. These are all decks that have won a Grand Prix in the Legacy format in the past 12 years. That said, let's get to some decks.
Here we have combo lands piloted by Jarvis Yu at Grand Prix Seattle Tacoma. Took down Grixis Delver in the finals. And this was very recent, right after the release of Battle for Zendikar. But what is the game plan of this deck?
So this lands deck is the same deck that people are still playing. Relies on the combo of Thespian Stage plus Dark Depths to put a indestructible 2020 Merit Lage into play. And there's not a lot of ways to deal with Merit Lage amongst the rest of the field. Overall, across all 8 decks, there's not a lot of Swords to Plowshares.
Sure. Yeah, that seems great for the indestructible 2020. So any interesting main deck decisions for this deck in Legacy 2015?
We're about a year and a half removed from when this was a deck, so you're not going to see the full impact of people looking backwards on Legacy or a deck like this. There's no main deck Bajuku Bog though, so it's going to have a much harder time against a deck like Reanimator. There's also no Caracas, which means that this lands deck is probably almost a complete dog all the way through against the very fast, efficient Reanimator deck that isn't here, as well as Flash Hulk. Whereas if they had main deck Bajuku Bog, there'd be a little bit more gameplay there. The Lone Wasteland engine is still going to be really good against any of the blue decks, though.
Yeah, absolutely. So how difficult would you consider this deck to play? And it's certainly not. Some of the mana bond draws seem pretty easy, but otherwise, if you're a little far behind or if you had to pay a few extra cards in hand for your bidding, how difficult is it going to be to actually assemble the 2020 with this deck?
I think most of the loam strategies are fairly straightforward in a build like this. You don't have complicated decision trees. You don't have a ton of tutors. You have 4 crop rotation, but your crop rotation is I'm going to find Dark Depths, I'm going to find Thespian Stage, or I'm going to find Tabernacle Maze of Ith, depending on where you are in the game itself. You don't really have to be planning these things quite as far ahead, and one of the bad matchups, or one of the most difficult matchups for lands, I should say, which is Miracles, isn't represented in this field quite the same way, in that you don't have the 6 islands, 2 plains. We're going to go super, super long Miracles deck here. You instead have the Flash Hulk Miracles deck, or Flash Hulk Counter Rounds deck, rather.
Right. So looking at the sideboard in this deck, the thing that really pops out to me is 2 copies of Choke. It seems great against a lot of these decks with island types in the actual land type. But what else pops out to you out of the sideboard on this?
The Force Sphere resistance is going to be kind of interesting because all these other decks are very to the ground, low on mana. So you kind of see in the contemporary Legacy field with the Delver strategies, and I think trying to figure out how this lands deck should sideboard is going to be one of the bigger challenges in the field as a whole, especially if you're not super familiar with lands. I'm sure you can get a primer from someone who does play the deck if you're in this top 8, but that's really where a deck like lands with its graveyard synergies wins and loses games, is on how well it's able to execute its plan against opposing team.
And finally, how does this deck value life and cards in hand in terms of bidding for it?
This lands deck is going to need some life to play with. You're going to need to give yourself 3 or 4 turns generally to be able to get 2020 in play, and if your opponent gained any life throughout the game, be able to attack twice. That said, this deck does not need cards in hand nearly as much. I don't think there's going to be a lot of push or a lot of contention on this deck either, because it is kind of a nuanced playstyle. But I think this deck is going to go in the 5 cards, 16, 17 life range, or the 6 cards, 13, 14 life range.
Yeah, this deck definitely seems like it can mulligan pretty aggressively, because once you start dredging Life Alone, you're seeing so many cards that mulliganing a little bit probably not going to hurt you too much.
Right, and I don't think the exploration get ahead of you strategy is needed quite as much, and that's kind of where the start with 7, be able to go down to 6 matters a lot more in terms of finding that exploration early on.
Sure. That is Combo Lance by Jarvis Yu.